Slam, slam, slam. The elderly couple on the other side of my paper-thin apartment wall wasn't making love. They were fucking. Don't get me wrong, my hat's off to keeping the spark alive into their late 80s. I hope that I can one day find a woman with the same libido that my neighbor must have had in the Eisenhower administration. My issue was that, due to the location of the door in my tiny bedroom, I could only fit my bed right next to our shared wall. I could hear each word of every whisper that passed between them. I knew about their pudding fetish. I couldn't tell you exactly what position a nasty salamander was, but it made very loud noises 6 feet above my mattress. Needless to say, I couldn't bring any carnal companions of my own to such a hellhole. They were at it every single night. But I was in my early 20s and couldn't afford an apartment that wasn't disgusting, so I was stuck. Until the day it stopped. I actually woke up because of the quiet. We come to accept things not because they are logical, but because they are familiar. Such was with the octogenarian fucking. So I enjoyed blissful, uninterrupted sleep. I even considered trying pudding again, but ultimately decided that I was done with the goo for good. And then the banging started once more. I actually cried when it happened, then lied to myself about it being a temporary thing. It wasn't a temporary thing. In fact, they had actually made a change to the routine, and the banging was now entirely localized to one spot on the wall right next to my pillow. Of course, I wondered what had happened, but I wasn't going to go asking questions. That didn't stop the little old lady in apartment 1913 from confronting me. "You're the boy from next door," she cooed in the hallway, shuffling around in nothing but mismatched slippers and a muumuu that looked to be about 1 atom thick. Next door lady blocked my path to the exit. I forced a smile. "That's right. Please don't hesitate to knock on my door if you need anything." She licked her sticky lips. That's how I came to understand that she had forgone her dentures. "Well, aren't you just scrumptious?" I'm noting going to lie. The way her throat gurgled at that last word made my skin crawl. I nodded, then turned to head back into my apartment. That's the last thing I remember. I awoke on a smelly wooden floor. I lurched, which is how I discovered that my hands were tied above my head while my ankles were bound to the wall. I was naked, cold, and having none of it. In fact, I was about to scream when I heard footsteps coming into the room. I struggled to turn around and see who it was, but my movement was extremely restricted. I was forced to wait as the person emerged next to my head. "You so remind me of my Harold," she gurgled. Vomit tickled my uvula as I recognized my neighbor. She stood over me with nothing but the muumuu, a very large chef's knife, and a smile. "You can't change the past, you know," she continued in that same voice. "Oh, we like to think that we can. Sometimes we even manage to do it for a while." She sighed, inadvertently snorting. But nature always finds a way in the end. The feeling of deep unsettlement was quickly being eclipsed by raw fear. Either this person was 4 wheels short of a tricycle, or she knew exactly what she was doing with the knife. I didn't know which was worse. It's only after accepting loss that we can move forward. She licked a thick line of drool from her baggy lips. "You're probably too young to understand that now. I'm only just beginning to realize it, and I'm almost 90. My body temperature dropped as I shivered uncontrollably. Above me, the woman blew a snot bubble with her left nostril. It popped. "You'll be angry at me. But one day, probably younger than me, you'll come to accept it." She wiped her snotty nose, then wiped her eye. "You so very much remind me of my Harold." The first sob escaped her lips. "I miss him every day." I am so sorry, Mrs. Neighbor Lady. But I assure you that I am not Harold, and that if he were here, he would politely but firmly request that you put down the knife and let me go." She gave me the saddest smile. "No, I don't think he would say that at all. Harold was always much more of a risk-taker than I ever was." A distant look came over her face, as though she saw something I couldn't. Several seconds passed before I realized she was staring at something specific, just past where I was looking. Fear shot through me. My crawling nerves told me that whatever was behind me would explain why I was chained to the floor. I was petrified at the idea of finding out, but what choice did I have? I couldn't stay on the ground forever. so I forced myself to crane my neck and catch a glimpse of whatever held her rapt attention. I told myself there was no way that whatever lay behind me warranted the pounding in my exposed chest. She was a sweet little old lady who was probably suffering from a mental condition that left her more imprisoned than I was in the moment. Right? There probably wasn't even anything behind me. I turned all the way around. A surprisingly large man's penis, fully erect, was nailed to the wall. Two realizations floated into my head despite my desperate attempts not to think. The first is that the dick was affixed to the wall directly opposed to my bed, inches from where I slept. The second is that the weathered penis was the source of the room's odor, because it was quite visually decaying. "You're quite mistaken, young man," she sighed. "Harold is here, at least part of him, and what a magnificent presence he is." The twinkle in her eye could have guided ships to harbor. "And our taxidermy hobby has kept him with me, even after death." I finally vomited. She didn't notice. But it couldn't last forever. She wiped her eye again before looking hungrily down at me and lifting the knife. "And you really do look so much like Harold when he was younger." She let me go afterward. I made it to the street outside of the apartment building before I collapsed from blood loss. I awoke 3 days later in a hospital bed. A doctor was already waiting for me. Apparently, my case was extremely interesting from an academic standpoint. "The blood transfusion saved your life, young man. That's the good news." I lay frozen in place, bracing for the other shoe to drop. His lips grew thin. "The bad news is that she escaped with it. Don't give up hope, though. The oddest circumstances sometimes result in donor penises."